Let's talk about the respiratory system, specifically about gas exchange within the alveoli of the lungs. What you see in this image right here, this green bunch of grape-looking structures are the alveoli, and these are the air sacs of the lungs. This is the final destination of oxygen when it comes in through our respiratory tract. There's an upper respiratory tract, a lower respiratory tract that we'll detail in another video. But ultimately, this is the business end of the respiratory system. That is to say, this is where gas exchange is going to occur, where we take in oxygen from the lungs, specifically from the alveoli, which are these air sacs, take the oxygen into our bloodstream, and we get rid of carbon dioxide, otherwise known as CO2. What we can see right here is oxygen moving into the bloodstream. So these light pink structures or blood vessels are known as the alveolar capillaries. Now, to be clear, what we see here is venous blood coming into the capillary bed. This is ultimately coming from the right ventricle. The right ventricle is pumping oxygen poor blood to the lungs to get rid of this CO2, move it into the alveoli, which then proceed through the lower reaches of the respiratory system, superiorly up to the upper part of the respiratory system, and then ultimately gets exhaled into the atmosphere. The opposite occurs with oxygen. We breathe in oxygen from the atmosphere through our mouth, through our nose, through the upper respiratory tract, the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and we'll outline all these in a subsequent video. But I really just want to start with the nuts and bolts of the respiratory system. Now, certainly the respiratory system has other functions or roles within the body. One is pH homeostasis, tied to carbon dioxide. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense to tease out the difference between pH homeostasis and levels of CO2 in the body, because they are directly related to each other. Without getting into details, an increase of CO2 in the body is going to cause an increase in the hydrogen ion concentration in the body. Said another way, because an increase in the hydrogen ion concentration is the same thing as a decrease in pH. An increase of CO2 in the body will result in a decrease in body pH, which we do not want. We need to tightly regulate levels of pH in the body. And one way of doing that is expelling carbon dioxide from the body, from the respiratory system. As we've talked about in previous videos, the respiratory system also aids in the return of blood back to the right ventricle via the respiratory pump. It helps facilitate speech and olfaction, otherwise known as smell. And it also plays a part in helping regulate blood pressure by releasing a signaling molecule known as angiotensin converting enzyme. For short, we refer to that as ACE. So we'll talk about all of these in detail in subsequent videos. The goal here is to talk about gas exchange. Now, one thing I want to point out is, why do we need oxygen? Everyone knows we need oxygen. It's very intuitive. I would say to everybody, if we don't have oxygen, life ends as we know it. Why do we need oxygen? We need oxygen to make ATP. Keep in mind the equation for cellular respiration. Glucose plus oxygen is going to produce ATP so our body can do work. I just want to clarify, our body is capable of making ATP in the absence of oxygen, and that is known as anaerobic respiration. Our body can produce ATP much more efficiently with oxygen and produce a lot more ATP with oxygen. So while our body is capable of making ATP without oxygen anaerobically, it's not as efficient. Here, I just want to take a brief look at the entire respiratory system. We see the oral cavity, nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx. This is the bronchus. And I'll go into a lot more detail on this in a subsequent video. We have the right and left lung. The right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2 lobes. This right here is the diaphragm, which is the major muscle of respiration. And at the distal end of all of these pipes right here, we have bronchi, primary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, that terminate into bronchioles. And at the end of those bronchioles, we're going to have the air sacs known as alveoli. And that's the focus, once again, of this video, is the gas exchange between the alveoli and the alveolar capillaries. Another thing I want to point out is there are 2 points of gas exchange throughout the body, and not just specifically 2 localities, but we have gas exchange at the tissues, and these are nearly all the tissues of the body that certainly have sufficient blood flow going to them. Let's just say the big toe, the myocardium, the brain, the pancreas, throughout the whole body. The systemic circulation leaving the left ventricle of the hearts distributes and perfuses oxygen throughout the whole body. So these tissues and the cells of those tissues can grab that oxygen to make more ATP. This is what this is showing. This is a capillary bed where gas exchange occurs at the tissues. Gas exchange is also occurring at the lungs. The big difference is at the tissues, oxygen is leaving the bloodstream and carbon dioxide is entering the bloodstream. Whereas at the lungs, oxygen is entering the bloodstream and carbon dioxide is leaving the bloodstream. To be clear, carbon dioxide is leaving the bloodstream at the lungs so it can move into the alveoli and be exhaled from the body. And certainly oxygen is moving from the alveoli into the bloodstream so it can then move back to the heart via the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, left ventricle, and then perfuse throughout the whole body via the systemic circulation. So just to be clear, 2 broad categories of gas exchange, at the lungs and then at the tissues. Okay, so I just want to look at this picture once again very briefly. This is a bronchiole right here, which is giving rise to a big cluster of alveoli that we see in green, covered by these alveolar capillaries. So there's exchange between the alveolar capillary and the alveoli. Alveoli is plural, alveolus is singular. So in the subsequent image, we're just going to focus on one particular alveolus and a capillary running by it. Okay, so here is in pink the alveolar capillary. In green, we have the alveolus. And the alveolus is composed of 2 main types of cells, type 1 alveolar cells and type 2 alveolar cells. Type 1 alveolar cells are simple squamous epithelial cells. Type 2 alveolar cells are cuboidal epithelial cells. Now, I need to retract that statement. I said type 1 are simple squamous. Simple is referring to the actual tissue being one layer, which it certainly is. But a type 1 cell is just one particular cell, and we don't need to use the term simple for it. So a type 1 cell is a squamous epithelial cell, where a type 2 cell is a cuboidal epithelial cell. And that's what we see right here. This is a type 2 cell, very cuboidal in nature, and all of these are simple squamous epithelial cells. Now, one thing that is not correctly reflected in this image is the type 2 cells are much, much smaller than the type 1 cells. I have the type 2 cells large there just so we can see them and differentiate them between the type 1. But the cuboidal cells only occupy 5% of the total surface area of the alveolus, whereas 95% of it is made up of the type 1 squamous cells. But there are more type 2 cells than type 1. That is to say, there's more of these cuboidal cells than the squamous cells. even though the type 1 alveolar cells make up 90% of the surface area. And that's because these type 2 cuboidal cells are so small. So the gas exchange occurs between the type 1 alveolar cells, the squamous cells, and these capillaries. Now keep in mind that a capillary is composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue known as endothelium. So we have a squamous cell right here and another squamous cell right here. A squamous cell of the capillary or of the endothelium and a squamous cell of the lining of the alveolus. Each epithelial tissue has a basement membrane. So this teal color right here is the basement membrane for the type 1 alveolar cells. And the orange here is the basement membrane for the endothelium of the blood capillary. There probably should be a tiny interstitial space between these two basement membranes. I can't say that for sure. Some books suggest that these two basement membranes actually meld into one basement membrane, but I really think there's going to be a slight interstitial space between the basement membrane of the alveolus and the basement membrane of the capillary. Nonetheless, when oxygen passes from the alveolus into the capillary, it is diffusing a very short distance across this squamous cell, the basement membrane or membranes, if you will, across this simple squamous cell into the blood circulation. Carbon dioxide is going to go the other direction. Once carbon dioxide moves into the alveolus, it then can proceed superiorly out the remaining part of the respiratory system. The function of the type 2 alveolar cells is twofold. One, it helps support and maintain the type 1 alveolar cells, the squamous cells. Two, and arguably more important, is the type 2 alveolar cells secrete a substance known as surfactant. Surfactant reduces surface tension or eliminates surface tension. And surface tension results when water molecules bind to each other via a process known as hydrogen bonding. Don't worry too much about the hydrogen bonding. I will detail that in a physiology video. But it causes things to stick together. If you take, for example, two panes of glass or microscope slides, dip them in water, and put them next to each other or contacting each other, you can slide those pieces of glass or microscope slides against each other, but it's very challenging to pull them apart because of the surface tension. Surface tension would be a problem if there were no surfactant. The alveoli are lined with a thin layer of fluid to keep them nice and moist. But the problem with that fluid is it can create surface tension, and it could cause the walls of the alveolus to stick together, which we don't want. During inhalation, we want the alveoli to be nice and plump and expanded. During exhalation, they decrease in size and the walls get closer together. And they may get close enough that the walls will stick together due to the surface tension. But surfactant eliminates the surface tension, so there's no worry of the walls sticking together. And in light blue right here within the alveoli and also in the interstitial space between alveoli, we find phagocytic cells known as dust cells, which are going to engulf foreign material or pathogens trying to enter the bloodstream. And trying to enter the bloodstream via the alveoli seems like a prime place to do so for some pathogens. There's a direct route into the bloodstream. If a pathogen gets in the bloodstream, theoretically, then it can spread throughout the body, were it not for our immune system that we talked about previously. So that's gas exchange between the alveolus and the capillary. I just want to talk about surface tension really quick. Here you see a faucet of dripping water, and it's not uncommon to see a drop of water just sticking to that faucet in a big clump before gravity sets in and the weight of that water droplet falls. But it's sticking together like this because of surface tension. Water is made up of H2O molecules which stick together, and that is surface tension. It is a great example of surface tension, and certainly a good example of even these other droplets that have fallen but are still maintaining that droplet form because all these water molecules are bound to each other. Surface tension is something we absolutely do not want in our alveoli. And that's a problem with premature babies. Some of them don't have surfactant produced yet. And without the surfactant, they have respiratory problems. To be clear, surface tension is good in certain areas of the respiratory system, specifically between the serous membranes of the lungs, the parietal and visceral pleura. We'll talk about that. But we do not want surface tension within the alveoli. And that is prevented by the surfactant release from the type 2 alveolar cells.